On Thanksgiving Day, November 26, 1857, the wealthy plantation owner Marcus Thornhill sat down to dinner with his family in their elegant dining room in Little Rock, Arkansas. An hour later, he was found dead in his study, his neck broken with such force that witnesses said his head had been twisted nearly backwards. The only person present in the room when he died was an enslaved man named Samson, who calmly admitted to killing his master, but refused to explain why beyond saying he had it coming. Over the next 3 weeks before his execution, Samson revealed a story of systematic brutality and calculated revenge that would shock even the hardened slaveholding society of Antebellum, Arkansas. But what made Samson's case particularly disturbing was not just the murder itself, but what investigators discovered about Marcus Thornhill's private activities when they searched his study after his death. Hidden journals documented years of sadistic experiments on enslaved people, including Samson's wife and children, that went far beyond the normal cruelties of slavery. Before we descend into this tale of rage, revenge, and the darkest corners of human cruelty, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below, because what you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing stories of slavery and retribution in American history. This is Epoch of Fear, where buried truths refuse to stay silent. Little Rock, Arkansas in 1857 was a growing city, the state capital and a center of cotton commerce that had prospered enormously in the 2 decades since. Arkansas achieved statehood in 1836. The city's wealth was built entirely on slavery and the cotton trade, with wealthy plantation owners maintaining townhouses in Little Rock while managing vast agricultural operations in the surrounding countryside. The social hierarchy was rigid and explicitly racial, with white men at the top wielding absolute power over everyone below them, particularly over the enslaved African Americans, who made up nearly half the population in some parts of Arkansas. Marcus Thornhill was among Little Rock's wealthiest citizens, a man who owned 3 plantations totaling over 4,000 acres and over 200 enslaved people. He had inherited significant wealth from his father, but had multiplied it through shrewd business dealings and a reputation for maximizing productivity on his plantations through innovative management techniques. These techniques, as would later be discovered, included methods that went far beyond the standard brutalities of plantation slavery and crossed into territory that even other slaveholders found disturbing. Thornhill was 43 years old in 1857, married to Cordelia Thornhill Nee Whitaker, with 3 children ranging in age from 8 to 15. He presented himself as a refined Southern gentleman, educated at Princeton, well-traveled, cultured in his tastes, and sophisticated in his manner. He served on the boards of banks and charitable organizations, attended the Episcopal Church regularly, and donated generously to causes supporting Southern interests. His public persona was that of a respectable pillar of the community, a man of wealth used responsibly and power exercised with appropriate gravitas. But behind the public facade, Marcus Thornhill harbored interests and engaged in activities that revealed a profoundly disturbed and cruel personality. He kept detailed private journals, written in a personal code, documenting experiments he conducted on enslaved people. These experiments ranged from testing their pain tolerance under various conditions to investigating how long human beings could survive without food, water, or sleep. He approached these experiments with clinical detachment, recording results methodically, as if conducting legitimate scientific research, rather than torturing human beings for his own twisted curiosity. Samson was born enslaved on a Virginia plantation around 1827, making him approximately 30 years old in 1857. He was given the name Samson by his mother, a woman who had been taught biblical stories by a kind mistress and who hoped her son would possess the strength of the Old Testament figure. Samson grew to be physically powerful, standing over 6 feet tall with a muscular build developed through years of heavy labor. He was intelligent and observant, qualities that made him valuable as a skilled worker, but also made him dangerous in ways his various owners did not fully appreciate. Samson was sold multiple times through his 20s, always for good prices reflecting his physical capabilities and skills in carpentry and blacksmithing. In 1852, at age 25, he was purchased by Marcus Thornhill at an estate sale in Memphis. Thornhill saw potential in Samson beyond just labor capacity. He saw a subject for his experiments, a strong specimen that could endure more than weaker enslaved people and provide better data on human physical limits. Also sold at that Memphis auction was a young woman named Eliza, approximately 20 years old, who was purchased by Thornhill specifically to be paired with Samson. Thornhill believed in breeding enslaved people for specific traits, and he saw Samson and Eliza as ideal genetic material for producing strong, healthy children who would eventually be valuable property. He allowed them to marry in a slave ceremony, gave them a small cabin on his plantation outside Little Rock, and encouraged them to have children with the cold calculation of someone breeding livestock. Eliza gave birth to their first child, a son they named Joshua, in 1853. A daughter named Sarah followed in 1855. Samson and Eliza tried to create a family life despite the impossible circumstances of slavery, loving their children fiercely and attempting to protect them from the worst horrors of their condition. For a few years, their lives followed the brutal but predictable patterns of plantation slavery. Hard labor, minimal food and rest, the constant threat of violence, but also moments of family connection and the small joys that people create even in the darkest circumstances. But in 1856, Marcus Thornhill's interest in Samson's family took a darker turn. Thornhill had been conducting experiments on enslaved people for years, but most of his subjects had been individuals without families, people whose suffering and death would be noticed by fewer people and investigated by no one. He had avoided experimenting on children or people with strong family bonds, because even in the brutal world of slavery, destroying families was considered bad business and could create unrest that affected plantation operations. However, by 1856, Thornhill's compulsions had grown stronger and his caution had diminished. He began including Samson's family in his experiments, starting with minor tests but gradually escalating. He would deprive Eliza of food for extended periods to see how long she could maintain the ability to work and nurse their infant daughter. He would subject Joshua to extreme heat and cold to test the resilience of young children to environmental stress. He documented these experiments in his coded journals, noting physical responses, breaking points, recovery times. Samson was forced to watch these experiments, his hands bound to prevent him from intervening. Thornhill believed this added an additional dimension to his research, allowing him to observe the psychological effects of forcing a parent to witness their children suffering. He recorded Samson's reactions with clinical interest, noting at what point psychological torture broke a man's spirit, how long defiance could be maintained before it turned to despair. For months, Samson endured this hell while maintaining an exterior of submission. He worked as commanded, showed no sign of rebellion, gave Thornhill no reason to increase security around him. But internally, he was planning, waiting for the right moment, preparing for the revenge that he had decided was worth dying for. Because Samson understood that killing a white man, especially his owner, would result in execution. There was no possible outcome where he survived. But he had decided that if he was going to die anyway, he would take Marcus Thornhill with him and at least end his family's suffering. The opportunity came on Thanksgiving Day, 1857. Thornhill had invited extended family and business associates to a large dinner at his Little Rock townhouse. The enslaved workers, including Samson, who had been brought from the plantation specifically to serve at the dinner, spent the day preparing food and serving the white families. Samson, who was trusted due to his years of apparent docility, was allowed to move through the house relatively freely, serving courses and clearing dishes under the supervision of the house staff. After the main meal, Thornhill excused himself to his study, claiming he needed to review business correspondence before returning for dessert. He summoned Samson to the study to bring him brandy and cigars. This was not unusual. Thornhill often had enslaved workers serve him in his study during social events. What was unusual was that Thornhill dismissed the other servants and closed the study door, leaving himself alone with Samson in a room far from where the dinner party continued. What happened in the next few minutes was reconstructed from physical evidence in Samson's later confession, because no one witnessed the actual killing. Thornhill, emboldened by brandy and the comfortable atmosphere of Thanksgiving with family, made comments to Samson about his children. He said that Joshua was showing promise as an experimental subject, that the boy had unusual pain tolerance that would allow more extensive testing. He said this casually, as one might discuss the qualities of livestock, completely failing to recognize or care that he was speaking to the boy's father. Something in Samson broke in that moment. The careful control he had maintained for over a year, the submission he had performed to avoid giving Thornhill reason to escalate the torment, the hope he had clung to that somehow his family might survive if he just endured long enough, all of it shattered. Years of accumulated rage focused into a single point of absolute clarity. Thornhill would die, today, now. Samson moved with the speed and power that had given him his biblical name. Thornhill, comfortable in his study, with his back partially turned to Samson as he reached for his cigar box, had no warning. Samson's hands, hardened by decades of labor, closed around Thornhill's neck from behind. Thornhill struggled, tried to call for help, reached backward, trying to strike Samson or break free. But Samson was larger, stronger, and motivated by a lifetime of hatred that gave him strength beyond what his considerable physical power already provided. Samson lifted Thornhill off the ground by his neck, cutting off his air supply completely. Thornhill's struggles grew weaker as oxygen deprivation took effect. Within perhaps 30 seconds, Thornhill lost consciousness. A normal person might have stopped there, might have allowed the unconscious man to live while they escaped. But Samson had not planned to escape. He had planned to kill, and he completed that plan with methodical brutality. While Thornhill was unconscious but still breathing, Samson twisted his head with tremendous force, snapping his neck with such violence that the vertebrae shattered audibly. Witnesses would later report hearing a crack from inside the study that sounded like a branch breaking, though at the time no one understood what they were hearing. Samson continued twisting, fueled by years of rage, until Thornhill's head was turned at an angle that would have been impossible if his neck was intact. Samson then lowered Thornhill's body to the floor, arranged it so that it was visible from the door, and sat in a chair to wait. He did not attempt to flee or hide. He simply waited, calm and still, for someone to discover what he had done. After approximately 10 minutes, when Thornhill did not return to the dinner party, Cordelia Thornhill went to the study to check on her husband. She knocked, received no answer, opened the door, and saw her husband's body on the floor with Samson sitting nearby. Her screams brought everyone in the house running. Male guests rushed into the study, saw the body, saw Samson sitting calmly, and several drew pistols they carried, as was common among wealthy Southern men. But Samson made no move to attack or escape. He simply said, "I killed him. He deserved it. You can do what you want now." The authorities were summoned immediately. Little Rock's constables arrived within 20 minutes, along with the coroner who examined Thornhill's body and declared that he had died from a broken neck, inflicted with such force that it indicated tremendous physical strength and rage. Samson was taken to the city jail, placed in chains, and held for trial. The case was simple. Samson admitted to the killing. There was no question of guilt. The only questions were why and what should be done with him. The why became apparent when investigators searched Thornhill's study in the days following his death. Among his papers were journals written in a personal code that initially baffled everyone who examined them. But Thornhill had been arrogant enough to keep a cipher key, believing his code was unbreakable, but wanting to ensure his scientific observations could be understood by posterity. Using the key, investigators decoded the journals and discovered years of documented experiments on enslaved people. The journals revealed systematic torture disguised as scientific inquiry. Thornhill had been testing pain tolerance by inflicting various forms of suffering and recording how long subjects could endure before they broke. He had been starving people to document the effects of malnutrition on different ages and body types. He had been depriving people of sleep for extended periods to observe the psychological effects. He had been subjecting children to extreme temperatures and documenting their responses. The entries about Samson's family were particularly detailed and disturbing. Thornhill had recorded subjecting Joshua to cold baths that lasted hours, timing how long the child could endure before losing consciousness. He had forced Eliza to work in fields during the hottest part of summer days without water, documenting how long she could maintain productivity before collapsing. He had subjected infant Sarah to various stimuli designed to provoke fear responses, recording her crying patterns and stress indicators as if studying an animal specimen. The journals also revealed that Thornhill had killed at least 7 enslaved people through his experiments, deaths he had concealed by claiming the victims had died from disease or accidents. The bodies had been buried in unmarked graves on his plantations, their deaths never investigated because enslaved people died regularly and white authorities rarely cared to determine exact causes when the deceased were property rather than people. The discovery of these journals created a crisis for Little Rock's elite. On one hand, Thornhill had been one of them, a respected member of their community whose murder by an enslaved person demanded the harshest possible punishment to maintain the social order that slavery required. On the other hand, the journals revealed behavior so extreme that even other slaveholders were disturbed. If the contents became widely known, it could provide ammunition to abolitionists in the North who argued that slavery corrupted everyone it touched and enabled atrocities. The decision was made to suppress the journal's contents while proceeding with Samson's prosecution and execution. A few prominent citizens were informed of what the journals contained, but the general public, and even most of the white community in Little Rock, were never told the full extent of Thornhill's activities. The official narrative was that Samson had murdered his master during a robbery gone wrong, a simple case of an enslaved person turning violent and deserving immediate execution. But Samson, when given the opportunity to speak during his brief trial, told a different story. He described in calm, detailed testimony what Thornhill had done to his family, corroborating what the suppressed journals documented. He explained that he had killed Thornhill to end his family's suffering, that he knew he would die for it, but considered his life a fair trade for stopping the experiments. He said that Thornhill was not a man but a demon, and that killing him was not murder, but the elimination of something evil. The court did not allow Samson's testimony to be recorded in official transcripts. But several people who attended the trial, including a few journalists and abolitionist observers who had traveled to Little Rock specifically because they had heard rumors about the case, recorded what Samson said and later published accounts. These accounts reached northern newspapers and abolitionist organizations, making the case briefly famous in anti-slavery circles before being largely forgotten as the nation moved toward the Civil War. Samson was sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out on December 18, 1857, 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. The speed of the trial and execution was designed to minimize public attention and prevent Samson from becoming a symbol of resistance that might inspire other enslaved people. But during those 3 weeks between conviction and execution, Samson became exactly that symbol despite authorities' efforts to prevent it. The jail where Samson was held was not designed to prevent communication between prisoners and visitors. Enslaved people from Little Rock and surrounding plantations found ways to visit or send messages, asking Samson about his story, about what Thornhill had done, about whether killing his master had been worth it. Samson's responses passed through the network of communication that enslaved people maintained despite all efforts to suppress it were consistent and clear. He had no regrets. He would do it again. Marcus Thornhill had deserved to die, and if the cost was Samson's own life, he accepted that cost gladly. These messages spread through the enslaved community in Arkansas and beyond, carried by workers who moved between plantations, by families who had relatives in different locations, by the informal networks that allowed enslaved people to maintain connections, despite being legally prohibited from traveling or communicating freely. Samson became a hero in the slave quarters, a man who had struck back against impossible odds, who had proven that even the most powerful master was vulnerable if someone was willing to pay the ultimate price. White authorities became increasingly nervous as December 18th approached. They worried about potential uprising, about enslaved people being inspired by Samson's example to violence against their own masters. Security was increased on plantations throughout the region. Enslaved people faced stricter controls and harsher punishments for minor infractions, as nervous owners tried to preempt any possibility of rebellion. Some slaveholders discussed whether Samson's execution should be carried out in secret to avoid creating a public spectacle that might glorify his actions. But the decision was made to execute Samson publicly, as originally planned, reasoning that seeing him hanged would serve as a deterrent, reminding enslaved people of the consequences of violence against white people. The execution was scheduled for noon on December 18th in the center of Little Rock, in a public square where such executions had been conducted before. Hundreds of people gathered, both white and black, to witness what would become one of the most memorable executions in Arkansas's history. Samson was brought from the jail in chains, walking calmly between guards who seemed more nervous than their prisoner. He was led to the gallows platform, positioned on the trapdoor, and fitted with a noose around his neck. The presiding official read the charges and sentence, declaring that Samson had been convicted of murdering his master Marcus Thornhill and was sentenced to death by hanging. Then, following the custom of the time, Samson was given an opportunity to make final words. What Samson said in those final moments was recorded by multiple witnesses and later published in various accounts, though the exact wording varies between sources. The most complete version, recorded by an abolitionist journalist who was present, captures the essence of his statement. Samson spoke clearly and without apparent fear, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I killed Marcus Thornhill," he said. "I broke his neck with my hands because he deserved to die for what he did to my family and to others who could not fight back. He called himself a scientist, but he was a torturer. He called us property, but we are people, and people have limits to what they can endure. I reached my limit when he told me what he planned to do to my son. So I killed him, and I would kill him again if I could. You are going to hang me now, and I accept that. I knew this would be the price when I put my hands on him. But I want you to know that I am not sorry. I am not repentant. I did what needed to be done. And I hope that someday, when slavery is ended as it must be ended because it is evil and unsustainable, people will remember that we did not submit quietly to the worst abuses. We fought back when we could, even when fighting back meant dying. To the enslaved people watching, I say this: do not mourn me. I am free now in a way I never was while Marcus Thornhill lived. And my children will grow up knowing their father died, fighting the man who tortured them, not submitting to him. That is the legacy I want." The official in charge ordered Samson to be silent, but Samson continued speaking until the trapdoor was opened and he dropped, the rope tightening and breaking his neck instantly. The crowd stood in shocked silence for several moments after his body stopped moving. Then the white spectators began to disperse, many disturbed by what they had witnessed, by the dignity and clarity Samson had shown in his final moments, by the uncomfortable truths he had spoken about slavery's cruelties. The enslaved people in the crowd remained longer, standing in silent witness to the execution of a man many of them considered a hero. They were eventually dispersed by authorities, who who did not want large groups of black people gathering in public, but they carried what they had seen back to their communities, preserving the memory of Samson's words and his final act of defiance. Samson's body was not returned to his family or given a proper burial. Following the common practice for executed enslaved people, his body was taken by medical students at a local college and used for anatomical study and dissection. This was considered appropriate because enslaved people were property, and their bodies, even after death, had no rights or protections. The practice was common throughout the South, with executed enslaved people providing most of the cadavers used in medical education, since white families would not allow their relatives' bodies to be used for such purposes. The fate of Samson's family after his execution is unclear from surviving records. Eliza, Joshua, and Sarah were legally the property of Marcus Thornhill's estate and became part of the assets distributed to his widow and children. They may have been sold to other owners, or they may have been retained by the Thornhill family to work on the plantations. There are no records of their lives after December 1857, and they disappear from history, like millions of other enslaved people whose individual stories were never recorded or preserved. The Thornhill family recovered from Marcus's murder with surprising speed. Cordelia Thornhill, despite learning about her husband's secret activities from the suppressed journals, maintained that he had been a good man who had been murdered by an ungrateful and violent slave. She raised her children to believe this narrative and ensured they understood that enslaved people were dangerous and required strict control to prevent similar incidents. The Thornhill plantations continued operating under management by overseers, producing cotton that made the family wealthy throughout the remaining years before the Civil War. The journals that documented Thornhill's experiments were never made public during the antebellum period. They remained in the possession of Arkansas's authorities, who had decided that revealing their contents would cause more harm than good. After the Civil War, when Arkansas came under Union control and slavery was abolished, the journals were briefly examined by federal investigators looking for evidence of war crimes and atrocities committed under slavery. But by that point, with Marcus Thornhill dead and the larger crimes of slavery itself being addressed through Reconstruction, pursuing justice for Thornhill's specific victims seemed less urgent. The journals eventually ended up in the Arkansas Historical Society's archives, where they remained largely unexamined until the early 20th century, when historians researching slavery began to uncover them. Even then, the contents were considered too disturbing for publication, and scholarly articles that referenced the journals described their contents in general terms, without providing the graphic details that Thornhill had recorded. It was not until the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, when interest in slavery's full history increased, that researchers began to examine and discuss the journals more openly. Modern historians who have studied Thornhill's journals consider them among the most disturbing primary source documents from the slavery era. They provide a window into a mind that was simultaneously intelligent and monstrous, capable of careful observation and systematic record-keeping, while completely lacking in empathy or moral constraint. Thornhill's writings reveal someone who genuinely believed he was conducting legitimate science, who saw enslaved people as experimental subjects rather than human beings, and who felt no guilt about the suffering he inflicted. The journals also reveal that Thornhill was not unique. His writings reference correspondence with other slaveholders who shared his interests in human experimentation, suggesting a network of wealthy men who engaged in similar activities and exchanged information about their findings. Some of these correspondents were identified by historians, revealing that several prominent Southern families participated in or knew about systematic torture disguised as scientific research. This network was never prosecuted or fully exposed because the Civil War intervened, and by the time the war ended, many of the participants were dead or had escaped accountability. Samson's case became a footnote in most histories of slavery, mentioned briefly as an example of violent resistance, but rarely examined in detail. Abolitionist literature of the 1850s and 1860s sometimes referenced his execution as evidence of slavery's cruelty and the injustice of a system that executed enslaved people for defending their families while protecting slaveholders who committed atrocities. But as the immediate memory of slavery faded after the Civil War and Reconstruction, Samson's story was largely forgotten. In recent decades, historians and activists have worked to recover and preserve stories like Samson's, recognizing that enslaved people who resisted violently deserve to be remembered as freedom fighters rather than dismissed as criminals. Samson's willingness to sacrifice his life to end his family's torture, his clear-eyed acceptance of the consequences of his actions, and his powerful final words all mark him as someone who understood resistance and chose it deliberately, despite knowing it would cost him everything. The moral questions raised by Samson's case are complex and have no easy answers. He committed murder, taking a life in a premeditated act that violated both the laws of his time and the moral codes of most societies. But he did so in response to systematic torture in defense of his family, within a system that offered him no legal recourse or protection, and against a man who had himself committed multiple murders that went unpunished because his victims were enslaved. Can violence in response to oppression be justified? Can killing in defense of family be considered murder when the legal system provides no other means of protection? How do we judge historical figures who violated laws we now consider unjust in order to resist conditions we now recognize as evil? These questions are not merely historical, but remain relevant to contemporary debates about violence, resistance, justice, and the obligations people have to laws and systems they consider fundamentally immoral. What is clear is that both Samson and Marcus Thornhill were products of a slave system that corrupted everyone it touched, though in very different ways. Thornhill's corruption was moral and psychological, transforming whatever humanity he might have possessed into something monstrous that sought power through the suffering of others. Samson's corruption, if it can be called that, was forced upon him by circumstances, driving him to violence he likely would never have committed in a free society where he had alternatives to protect his family. The legacy of Samson's case extends beyond the specific facts of his crime and execution to encompass broader questions about resistance under oppression. Throughout history, oppressed people have faced the question of whether and when to resist violently, knowing that such resistance will likely result in their deaths, but might also strike back against their oppressors in meaningful ways. Samson's answer to that question was clear. When the cost of submission becomes unbearable, when the only alternative to violence is watching your family be destroyed, then violence is justified regardless of consequences. This answer was shared by other enslaved people who resisted violently during the slavery era. From the numerous individual acts of violence against masters that are documented in historical records to the larger organized rebellions like Nat Turner's uprising in Virginia or the German Coast uprising in Louisiana. These acts of resistance were always punished with extreme violence, with executions designed to terrorize other enslaved people into submission. But they occurred anyway, demonstrating that even the most brutal oppression cannot completely suppress the human will to resist. The memory of resistance, whether successful or doomed, served important purposes for enslaved communities. It reminded people that they were not powerless, that masters were vulnerable, that the system of slavery was not invincible, even if it was nearly so. Stories like Samson's, passed from generation to generation in slave quarters, despite all efforts to suppress them, provided psychological sustenance to people living under impossible conditions, proving that submission was not the only option, even if resistance meant death. Modern commemoration of Samson is minimal and contested. There is no monument to him in Little Rock, no historical marker at the site where he was executed, no public recognition of his story, beyond occasional mentions in scholarly works about slavery and resistance. This erasure is deliberate, reflecting decades of reluctance to honor enslaved people who committed violence against white slaveholders, even when that violence was in response to atrocities and in defense of family. Some activists and historians argue that people like Samson deserve monuments and recognition as freedom fighters who resisted oppression in the only ways available to them. Others argue that glorifying violence, even violence committed in response to oppression, is dangerous and that there are better ways to commemorate resistance. These debates continue without clear resolution, reflecting ongoing disagreements about how to remember difficult and violent aspects of history. What is beyond debate is that Samson's story, and the stories of countless other enslaved people who resisted violently or died trying, deserve to be known and remembered. They are part of American history, revealing truths about slavery and resistance that are essential to understanding both the past and present. Ignoring these stories or suppressing them because they are uncomfortable does not change what happened, but rather allows the most important lessons of history to be forgotten. What do you think about Samson's actions and his case? Was he justified in killing Marcus? Thornhill, given the circumstances of systematic torture and the absence of any legal protection for his family? Should people who resist oppression violently be remembered as criminals or as freedom fighters? How do we balance recognition of the violence involved with understanding of the context that drove people to such desperate actions? And what lessons from Samson's era remain relevant today about resistance, oppression, and the limits of what humans can be forced to endure? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story challenged you to think about the complex moral questions surrounding resistance and violence under oppression, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We explore the historical stories that defy simple moral narratives, that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past and their ongoing relevance. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that oppressed people throughout history have always resisted, even when resistance meant certain death, and that their willingness to fight back deserves to be remembered. Remember Samson. Remember Eliza. Remember Joshua and Sarah. Remember the 7 people Marcus Thornhill killed in his experiments whose names we do not even know. Hit that subscribe button. Join our community committed to honest historical reckoning, and I'll see you in the next investigation. Because at Epoch of Fear, we believe that all stories deserve to be told, especially the ones that challenge us, disturb us, and force us to think about the nature of justice and the price of resistance. Remember Samson, the bone breaker of Little Rock, who snapped his master's. Remember him.